Transparency is not given until trust is earned.
Today on the show, we're joined by Michele Goedde, a leadership coach specializing in helping managers build and lead high-performing teams and in leaders developing their authentic style. Michele comes into the studio to share her thoughts on navigating the performance review. This is The Career Cue, the podcast focused on helping you navigate the signals in your career to keep you growing and moving forward in business and in life. Here's today's host, Danna Redmond.
Michele, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to talk about performance reviews and really sort of what happens if you don't get the result you're expecting. So, annual performance review time can be a really interesting time for an employee. I think they have some expectations and some anticipation of what their comments and their scores might be. So what do you advise for someone? How should they approach that performance review process?
I think the main thing is to remain open, that it's an opportunity to learn. It's really helpful to go in a little bit prepared with some thoughts about what you hope to gain from the conversation. And then it's also really helpful to think about what you think versus what you are expecting to hear. And is there any place where there might be a disconnect? So a good amount of prep work going in will mean that the conversation is more likely to be what you want it to be, even if the outcome isn't necessarily what you want it to be.
Oh, that's an interesting distinction there, as what is the conversation versus sort of the specific outcome of that. Tell me a little bit more about that. What does that prep look like?
I think the prep starts with a really good self-assessment. What are the things that I think I have accomplished? What is it that led to those accomplishments? Why do I think that those are accomplishments? And then what are the things that I have learned? What might I do differently if I could? What have I learned? And going in with this balanced sense of here's what went really well, here are some places of improvement, because it shows that you're open to feedback. And then it means that you're also starting off the conversation as a learning conversation, which really is the whole goal of a performance discussion. There is, of course, the rewards piece, which sometimes comes at the same time. Companies are actually moving away from that a little bit, where performance and rewards are disconnected. And no matter what happens in the end, what you should do is learn enough to make adjustments going forward.
That's interesting to think about, that it's a learning experience going in there and being open to that versus sort of walking in expecting to receive the golden star, the golden apple, or, whatever the piece of it is. So what do you recommend if someone gets feedback or gets results that they weren't expecting?
I anticipate there's some level of disappointment that needs to be acknowledged. So first, take the time that you need to be disappointed. Give yourself a little bit of a break to think about what happened there. Take a deep breath. Really analyze first, did it come as a surprise, or was there something there that maybe indicated this feedback was coming? So first, spend a little bit of time preparing. Second, think about what is it that I need to learn to move past this? And I think there's always a follow-up conversation that happens, which is to go in and say, gosh, this came as a surprise to me. I was disappointed to learn that we were disconnected. And then I think that is one of the main things is it's a swing and a miss in conversation almost all the time when you learn something that's a surprise. So the first thing is to figure out what was that gap and then figure out what you can do to prevent it from happening again. And I think it happens to all of us once, and the goal is to let it never happen again. And I think it goes a long way with your manager to say, I may have made a mistake here. I might not have been as forthcoming or open as I could have been. What can I do so that we don't have this gap going forward?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that if the feedback isn't what you're expecting, usually it's probably generally some, constructive feedback for you, something you might perceive as negative. But that's a piece of it. But it's also the fact that there was that disconnect. If you thought you were headed one way and your manager, had you headed a different way or had different feedback for you, what advice do you have for people to sort of dig into that disconnect from the employee perspective? What can they do?
First, figure out what it is. So I think the first time is identifying what it is. And so if it's something that you could have done, a missed opportunity, something you need to improve, I think the first thing is to identify what it is. And then I think it's to go in prepared to say, I'm interested in developing in this area. Can we work on this together? And then create a plan so that you're identifying what success looks like and then asking, can we continually check in to see if I'm progressing in the way that I need? Because one of the things, and I say this also having been a manager, one of the things I was always thinking about is how open to feedback is this person? And so as an employee, by going in, being open, really listening, and turning it into a learning conversation, you build confidence with your manager, and they start to learn about you that you actually can handle feedback, and then you're going to get more.
Right. And then that can open the ongoing conversations. Because if, your manager has some hesitation about how you're going to react to feedback, good or bad, they're human, right? They may
We don't give it.
Yeah, they may hesitate because they're like, wow, if I got to do this bad thing or, deal with this person and, their hesitation or their resistance to feedback. I only want to do this a couple times a year.
Exactly.
Right? From the manager perspective. So as you think about that disconnect and asking for more feedback or more frequent feedback, do you have any advice about just the emotional reaction that an employee might have, that an individual might have to hearing feedback that they don't expect? How do you think about that as an individual?
As an employee or as a manager?
As an employee.
As an employee, I think it's to experience it and to think about what is it that I'm experiencing. Am I disappointed? Am I frustrated? So I think it's giving yourself some space to experience it and identify what it is. And then turn it into what can I control, which is how do I not end up in this position again. And then I think sharing it with your manager goes a long way to say, gosh, this was really disappointing for me to hear. I hear you. I understand it. I want to learn more about it, but this was really hard for me. Because I think it shows that you're human, but it doesn't disregard the feedback and it doesn't put you on the defensive, which will immediately shut your manager down from giving you more. So this is really all about, I think, creating a relationship that's building towards a level of transparency where you're just speaking openly. And I happen to think as employees, we have a right to know everything that applies to us because then we can do something with it and we can make some choices. But transparency is not given until trust is earned. So how you show up to these conversations is what builds the trust that your manager will be as transparent as you would like. That's
a really important perspective there, right? That your manager has to trust that you are going to take this feedback and listen to this feedback in a positive sort of go forward manner. And so as that individual, as that employee, you have to build that trust through your behavior and your actions and the way you respond to sort of everyday situations.
Right.
I like that. I think that's so important. We hear a lot about the differences between the generations, the Millennials and Gen Xers. When it comes to, performance reviews and performance assessments, how do you see those differences playing out?
I think with millennials, it starts a little bit earlier. It starts when they're new on the job, they're new with a manager. It starts a little bit earlier in that there's 3 things that I consistently see that they need that's different than what a Gen X needs. The first one is they need context. They need to know the bigger picture. Their entire lives, they've been asking why, and everyone has stopped to tell them. Education now is based on them having context and awareness of the bigger picture to go into the details and do the work. And so taking the time to provide that context is essential, and it sets them up for success. Connected to that is they need a lot of structure. And they will admit they need a lot of structure, but they might not be able to tell you what that looks like. And that is not the same as telling them what to do. When they are told what to do, they are offended because what you're saying to them is you're not smart enough to figure it out. And they actually are plenty smart enough to figure it out. But they do need structure, and they need regular check-ins, and they need regular validation that they're on the right track. The third thing that they need is a lot of feedback because their parents, the education system, college, internships, they've always had a lot of feedback. And so they need a lot of time and a lot of feedback, and they need to sort things through to build confidence and the validation that they need to then go work independently. So how all of that shows up in performance reviews is they continue to need a lot of information. Any feedback will be met with a why. And so they're going to want a deeper level of information. They're less of the Generation X why, because I told you so. It's more of the why and then the detail behind it. Another little thing that I see is it's not uncommon with Generation Y for meeting expectations to mean the same as exceeding expectations. So making sure that there's a clear distinction when setting goals between what success looks like and what surpassing looks like. Because oftentimes in the people that I work with, they'll come back and say, well, my compensation package was average. Well, was your work average? Well, yes, but. So I think that that's one of those things is there's a difference interpretation when it comes to what exceeding. Sometimes I'll say to someone, well, look at the definition of bonus. It's for over and above. It's not for meeting. And that's a really new concept in some cases.
That's so interesting. I want to talk a little bit about that structure versus telling someone what to do. Can you differentiate those for me? Like, what does giving somebody structure look like?
There's a really good book, and he talks about this idea of micromanagement versus undermanagement. And so structure means setting clear parameters. This is what's flexible. This is what's not flexible. If the outcome, the budget, a specific piece of the results, the due date, if that's not flexible, then that's what you need to spell out. And then spell out what is flexible. And that is kind of the right size of management. And then the check-ins along the way are checking progress. Under management is not giving someone those clear parameters so they think they have more freedom than they don't. And then you come in with a hammer later and say, well, why isn't it done on this date? Well, I didn't know there was a hard due date. Micromanagement, which almost never happens, is when someone tells you what to do every step of the way.
Right.
And so you're looking for more of that right size management. So I think of structure as a container that someone operates within, and they know what they can't do outside of that structure, but what happens inside of the structure is totally up to them.
I love that concept, that idea of this box, right? So the structure is, here are these hard parameters. And oftentimes if it's a project, there is something. It's either budget or it's features or it's your deadline, right? Or there's some things that are those pieces that we must deliver on, right? But then like the how you go about getting there is where people can have some flexibility.
Right.
Got it. Okay. I love that. Now let's talk about that concept of exceeding versus meeting expectations. I'd love to hear more of your experience in your consulting work. Like, how do you help some of your clients get through that if they're confusing or maybe they're thinking exceeding is meeting or vice versa?
It ties back to a good conversation with a manager. And I recognize managers can be a little squirrely here. They like to, in a lot of cases, retain this freedom and flexibility about what success looks like. So you have to get a little bit more creative about how you ask. So first is really taking responsibility for setting your goals, not waiting to be told to go write them or not waiting to be handed them, but with the information you have to write a short set of goals. And they don't need to be pages and pages of how you think you will get it done. It's more of the top line. What is it that you're responsible to deliver? What is the purpose of that? And then what does success look like? The first time you write a set of goals, you probably can't write the what success looks like on your own because you're missing the perspective of what your manager thinks success looks like. So that's what gives you a little bit of the framework to go in and say, well, I think the result is this. First, what am I missing that would meet this goal? And getting really clear about that. And this is the place to hold your manager accountable by saying, is there anything else you're going to look for me to deliver this successfully? And then you can say, well, what might it look like if I exceed expectations here? And sometimes it's getting it done sooner. Sometimes it's hitting a higher sales target. But it's asking. And if you have thoughts about what you think it might be, share those thoughts. And then you can recap it to say, so you're telling me if I'm able to push it in these areas, that would be exceeding expectations for you, right? And then you're, in a way, contracting, kind of like you do when you're a consultant, so that you know what you're working towards.
Right. I love that idea of getting concrete about what success looks like and then what exceeding can look like too. Because just to the point of what's meeting your expectations. And a lot of times in a manager's mind, they may have like, this is what the project needs to do, or these are the sales targets you need to meet. And that's meeting. That would be success. I mean, it would be success. You have been successful in your job if you've met these things, right? You're not underperforming, but you are meeting that. But then there's that extra piece that is that exceeding and figuring out what that looks like, I think is so important, right? Because I've definitely know that I've been in situations where people have met and then they've defined what exceeding looks like. And it isn't necessarily what I as the manager or what the rest of the organization defines as exceeding. The extra stuff they did wasn't the piece that, really was, really added extra value in some way. So
exactly. And it gives you the chance to expose also, what does this person value? Because what a manager values influences how they evaluate. So if you're thinking that customer relationships are the most important thing, and you learn that your manager values accuracy or details, you're not set up for success without that information. So it gives you an opportunity to clarify those things.
And I know even within changing managers, a conversation we'd had earlier before we started recording about, just if you've changed managers at times, you are going along and this is what meeting and possibly exceeding looks like. But if you change managers or you change teams or a new manager comes into your team, you need to recalibrate that, don't you?
Completely. In a sense, you're starting over and having the whole set of conversations again that led you to clarity with the prior manager.
Because it's that individual relationship, a new manager in. It's a whole new relationship that you're starting there.
Exactly.
Great. Michele, this is a great topic, and I want to continue with this. But first, let's take a break. And then when we come back, I want to talk about the frequency of performance reviews.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out the show notes at thecareerq.com, where you can also subscribe to the podcast and sign up for our newsletter.
Welcome back. We're talking with Michele Goedde about what to do when your performance review results aren't what you expected or wanted. So, Michele, from a manager point of view, I know we always hear that the performance review process should not just be that 1 or 2 times a year when there's some formal HR process, some form to fill out that, HR looks at and validates against, but it should be an ongoing process. And from a manager perspective, sometimes they get caught up in running their business. So what advice do you have, or how do you suggest to an employee to sort of keep that conversation going?
Some people are really good at weaving this into a recurring one-on-one, but I would say that most of the time that conversation gets shortchanged. So I like the idea of a separate check-in. Once you get going, if you're doing this regularly, you probably only need 30 minutes. And I think starting with quarterly is a good framework. In particular, if you're new in role or you're early in career, because you do need more feedback. You do need more of that sense of, yep, I like what I saw in the last quarter, keep at it, here's some things to focus on, and then it allows not too much time to go by before you have another check-in. If you find you're pretty settled in role, you have the same manager, you have a good working rhythm, certainly you could look to go to 3 times a year or 2 times a year, but I like starting quarterly, if you can pull that off with your schedule.
Right. And so do you recommend an actual, scheduled meeting where they say, hey, this is, I want to get feedback. This is my feedback time. I request this. And that's the type of conversation that you actually set it up that way? Or do you walk in and surprise a manager with it? Like, what's the best way?
Definitely not surprising. I'd say that would affect the caliber of the feedback. So I think asking when you set your goals as a part of this to keep myself on track, to ensure that I'm set up for success, I'd like to have a quarterly check-in to review my progress. So I think it's a part of that contracting that you do when you set your goals. And then I think it's important to say, I'll own scheduling the meetings. I will own preparing for the conversation. I'm going to show up clear about what I'd like to learn. I will do a self-assessment. What I'd like from you is to participate in the conversation. So really, it's your career. It's your feedback. You're going to do most of the work.
That's a great point, right? It is your career. It's your feedback. And if you want it, you might have to ask for it or go after it. What's your take on if the feedback that your manager shares with you is from either internal partners or, customers that, came that's the kind of feedback that came as a surprise. They perceive you in some way, or, they've had a reaction to something you've done. What do you think about going out to partners and asking for feedback, or, in a place where you can ask customers for feedback? What would that look like from an employee perspective?
I think it starts with a conversation with the manager, and to learn as much as you can from them by saying, tell me more. Is this one person? Is this a pattern? Because I think sometimes one-off feedback can be situational. And if you learn that, it was this particular person and this happened, you might be able to reflect and say, I remember that scenario. I hear what you're saying, but there actually may not be actionable feedback to take away.
Right.
It might be something different. If it's a pattern, I think it's different. And then I think you can talk with your manager to learn, is it appropriate for me to reach out to those people? But your focus really needs to be, what can I do to be more successful? What could change your perception of me? It again ties back to, it's a learning conversation, because there's nothing worse than bombarding somebody with, I can't believe you said that about me.
Right.
Naturally, they're not very open to coach you. And that's really what you're looking for, is you're asking them to coach you to be more successful.
And I think about that. And, earlier we had talked about, if you're surprised by something or it's not the results you were expecting, it's that there's a disconnect in maybe perception, both of your perceptions, or a self-assessment versus somebody else's assessment. What if that disconnect continues to happen, right? Let's say you go through some of this, you've tried to set goals, or you have set goals, you think you've got clear goals, and you get in there, and again, you're surprised that you didn't meet expectations. And same manager, like, where can somebody go with sort of continued disconnectedness?
Sure. One of the things I think is important also to get a sense of is any of this outside of your control? Are you in a system that has a curve or an active comparison of your results against someone else's? Because sometimes I think that is actually why you're landing where you're landing, and that's information that you don't control. So putting yourself in a position to let go of what is outside of your control, sometimes that's the best that you can do. If you're finding that you are regularly in the same situation with your manager and you've done everything that you think you can do, I think that's an even different feedback conversation to say, I'm disappointed to find myself here again. I took these steps. We've had these conversations, and yet I'm again surprised. How do we make sure that that doesn't happen again? In extreme cases, you're in a bad spot. And I would say, might be time to find a new job.
Yeah, so it is an interesting perspective, right? What does that pattern look like? And is it differences every time? Or is it a consistent pattern where the two of you maybe just are not, your manager and you are not on the same track or going to be on the same track? And that's going to be a challenge for you as that individual.
You can't force someone to be engaged. And when you've done your part and they're not engaging with you, then I would say that most of us that have been in that situation only realize later we waited too long to make a change.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about goal setting. I know you had mentioned this earlier, but how do you start that? How should a person start that conversation with their manager? Where do they go, and how do they keep that conversation going after that?
I think it starts with acknowledging, I want to be successful. I want to make sure I meet the organization's needs, and I want to make sure that I get over the next window of time, whether it's a year or some other time frame. I want to make sure I get the most out of this opportunity. And for me, that starts with clear goals. And I've taken a stab at writing down what I think are the 3 to 5, I think, really clear goals. You don't have 12 of them. I've taken a stab at what I think the goals are. And I'd like to start with just clarifying first, what is it that I'm here to do? Are we in alignment about what's most important for me to accomplish? I don't think you need to say it, but there is very much truth to the fact that if you are wildly successful, your manager looks good. And so everything rolls upwards. If you're successful, your manager's successful. If your manager's successful, the organization is successful. And so I think that that's one of those things that you also can be thinking about is, I am a part of the overall organization being successful. And am I clear about what my part is?
I think that's so important. I was just thinking through that what does success look like? And be sure as the employee, right, the way you're defining success has to do with the organization's goals and objectives and the company's goals and objectives, right? I think is really important. Sitting and having sat on that manager side of the table, if somebody's, if their success is around, I want to get promoted or I want to go up, that's a little harder to manage sometimes. Somebody's expectations about their forward trajectory in an organization or their rewards. They're expecting certain things in rewards versus sort of what does success from an organizational perspective look like?
Right. And you bring up a good point we haven't talked about, which is what does growth look like to you?
Right.
Growth isn't always getting promoted. It might be learning a new skill. It might be taking on something new like management. It might be preparing to make a move to a different type of profession. And so I think there's a connection between, do those goals take you where you're going professionally, and do you know where you're headed professionally? I mean, if you are in a particular role, but you're passionate about pottery, might not fit in.
Right.
So there has to be some alignment to organization's goals, your goals, what you'd like to learn. And if there's wildly different goals and you can't meet them, again, you might not be in the right job.
Right. And that's an interesting perspective, making sure that the goals that you have really do align sort of up with your manager's goals and the organization's goals. And if there's, longer term goals that don't fit, maybe you've got some short term goals. If you have a long term goal to get into a new type of role, figuring how and if that has a place in your current structure, right?
Exactly. One of the things I saw consistently as an HR person and as a manager is the consistent highest performing people were in jobs that they loved, the jobs where they would say, I could hardly wait to go to work on Monday, and they aligned with what they were naturally talented at doing. And as easy as it sounds to make sure that's the position we're always in, sometimes it's a harder thing to pull off. And if you can, as much as you can, align those two things, it's a pretty easy recipe for success. But I find often that people don't really even know what's important to them or what they love, or they don't really know how to utilize their talents within a particular job. So they're doing a job that they can do, which is not necessarily sustainable and not nearly as much fun.
Right. So how do you suggest that people kind of even open up that conversation with their manager about these topics?
I think it's really just saying I'm interested in having a conversation with you about where I'm headed in my career. It's an invitation that most managers will say yes to, but you may have to be a little bit more creative if you have a manager that's not necessarily interested in being a career mentor. Sometimes your manager is your manager and you get feedback from them, but you have to seek from someone else more of this career guidance, career mentoring. And I think that's okay if you like what you're doing. But with someone, hopefully it's your manager, I think it's inviting them to a conversation about this is what's important to me. This is how I'd like to grow. This is how I'd like to contribute. Or I'm interested in learning these things. Can we talk about what that looks like within my job and within this organization?
I love that thought that it's an invitation. You have to invite that person sort of into giving you feedback or into what your goals are and then how they might be able to help you with that.
Yes. And then the second piece is showing up prepared. You're not going to get very far if you say, well, what do you think I should do? It's not your manager's job. Your manager's job is to listen and hear you and provide suggestions and be a partner with you in helping you get there. But you're the person that has to know where you're headed and what you want.
Yeah, so it comes back to sort of you driving your own career, and your manager can be a partner in that. And, if you have a career mentor, they're a partner in that too. But you are squarely, as that individual, have to be in that driver's seat.
Right.
This has been such a great conversation, Michele. Thank you so much. I want to jump into some of the questions that we always ask our guests here. So, Michele, tell me, what was your first job?
My first job was serving banquets. So restaurant hospitality.
Got it. So is there anything from that first job that you still use or you still reflect on?
I think that every single job I've ever had stems from my experience, and every person I've ever hired stems from my experience in food service, and that is customer service. I think that there is something amazing that can happen in any situation if you're thinking first about what does that other person need from me. Mm-hmm. So my entire career, I loved hiring people from hospitality and retail because if you're really good at customer service, I think you can solve pretty much any problem that comes your way.
I love that, right? That it is that customer service is such a great backbone. And for many folks, that is a first job. That is an available first job for many folks. So to think about that and what you can get from those jobs that you have as waiters or hosts and hostesses or in a retail setting.
Sure.
Definitely. So what have you read or listened to recently that you would recommend to others?
I've alluded to it in this conversation. It's not something recent, but it's something I draw upon all the time. And it's this wonderful little book called Thanks for the Feedback. And it's written by Stone and Heen that wrote another one of my favorites, which is called Difficult Conversations. And what I like about this book is it's written from the perspective of the receiver of feedback. And it goes beyond feedback is not just what's going well. And we've sort of evolved to feedback being what's going well. And if we can bolster up the good, maybe we can squeeze in a little bit of the what's not so good. And
Right.
Maybe we can hide it in a feedback sandwich. So this book talks about how do you get the whole spectrum of feedback? How do you get certainly what's going well and what should you keep doing? But how do you also learn what's not going well or what you can do to improve? And then also, where do you stand? Where are you headed? Are you on the right path? And it's got all of these just very straightforward techniques to have that kind of conversation so that you're actually getting the feedback that you want. So it, like this conversation has, really puts the responsibility on the person receiving the feedback.
Right. And that is so important. I love that just we keep coming back to that point that as that individual that wants to progress or move forward or grow or learn, that you've got to be the one to take charge with that. And
yes.
So I love that title, right? Just even the thank you for the feedback, because that's whether it's good or bad or you agree or don't agree, that's probably should be your first response is thank you for the feedback.
Exactly.
And I may need to go off and think about that and then come back and have more conversations. But, thank you and appreciating that. So those sound like two great books around feedback. So, Michele, what would your 90-year-old self say to you? If 90-year-old Michele walked in the door, what do you think she'd say?
I think about this question a lot, and I use this question a lot.
That's awesome.
I think what I continually come back to is when I'm 90, and I even think about this now at the age I'm at today, what seems hard today is going to look really easy, no matter what it is. The 90-year-old me is going to say, why did you not take that opportunity? Why did you not try? What if it would have worked out? So I think that it really would be, if you're thinking about it, you need to act on it because it's going to look easy. And I'm a person that doesn't really like regrets. And so the 90-year-old me would be really mad if I didn't act on it.
I love that sort of a no regrets attitude, right? Just go for it.
Yep.
Because I think that is an important perspective to take forward as, what seems hard today and challenging, and if you get a couple of weeks or months or years on it, you're like, oh, that wasn't hard. That wasn't worth the tears or sweat or...
Right. And what if it worked out?
Right. Perfect. Michele, this has been so great. Thank you so much for coming in, and I hope to chat with you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Be sure to head on over to thecareerq.com where you can get more information, show notes, and related articles to today's topic. Also, if you like what you're hearing, head on over to iTunes, subscribe to the podcast, and make sure you leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks again.
The Career Q podcast is produced by Lens Group Media and recorded at Jack Straw Cultural Center in the lovely Seattle, Washington. This is harder than it looks. It really is. I mean, you're just like, I'm like, that word I want. What's that word again?